Welcome to an all-important Indianomics discussion, a report by Quess Corp, the staffing company, on wage growth in the corporate sector in India, published in the Indian Express, has made policymakers sit up. The report says that average salaries in India over the past 5 years have risen by just between 1 and 5% per annum, which means, adjusted for inflation, people in the formal sector are earning less than they did 5 years ago, adjusted for inflation. Possibly in response to this report, the Chief Economic Advisor, V. Anantha Nageshwaran, has been advising India Inc. that there will not be enough demand for the products made by their companies if they pay their employees too less. So the question is the steep slowdown that we saw in the second quarter GDP and in the corporate earnings, EPS growth, in the second quarter because of low wage growth. And how does one resolve this? I have with me the author of the Quess Corp report, Lohit Bhatia, President Workforce at Quess Corp, and economist P. Balakrishnan, Professor at the Center of Development Studies, Thiruvananthapuram, and Amit Basole, Professor of Economics, specializing in labor at Azim Premji University. Professors and Mr. Bhatia, thank you very much for your time. Lohit, since this is so much about your report, please tell us the top 3 or 4 takeaways from your study.
So thank you very much, Latha, and glad to be with you on this show today morning discussing this all-important topic. This report was conducted and a detailed research was done somewhere at the beginning of this calendar year, and it was finally published a few months before the budget. In this report, we came out with the large macroeconomic data when it comes to employment and the job creation. The second, what we spoke about is what is the total labor market and how does that get subdivided. And the key takeaways from this report is all of us know we're about 140 crore Indians. In the working age population that is 15 to 59, the labor force participation rate is now a little over 61%.
Yes.
That's about 55 crore people. We also said that, by the way, contrary to popular belief that enough formal work is not getting created in the last couple of years, just in the years between 2017 to 2023, as per the EPFO data, about 6.7 crore people came into the formal work and created what is called a UAN or a universal account number. However, when you sum total all of these categories, we still said that a little over 11 crore people have some shape and form of formal work in India, which means that out of the total labor force, which is at about 55 crore, formal work at 11 crore is just about 20 or 21%.
Okay.
And that's what a report was talking about. The key recommendations which went to the policymakers before the Union Budget 24 as well was that how can the government aid and abet, and grow this sector.
Okay.
And last, before I pause, one of the key recommendations that we were speaking about was incentivizing formal job creation, which in many ways we see as the ELI, which came out from the government.
Fair point. I mean, that's very thorough. But, what got published in the Indian Express and what led to the CEA's comment is the level of the salary. I mean, besides the fact that you're only giving us nominal, you're not adjusting it for inflation. And even then, the growth in the BFSI sector is just 2.8% for those 5 years, compounded annual. For engineering, it's terrible. Engineering, manufacturing, infrastructure, we would think is important. And, you would have engineers there. And that is just 0.8, less than 1% growth every year. Likewise, I can go on. That salary increase looks very small. Actual salaries is terrible. You're telling us it is 17,500 in BFSI and some 20,000 odd in other sectors. Only IT looks a little respectable at 40,000. I mean, these are average salaries. They are that low?
So let me clarify a few points here, Latha. First, this is from the period 2019 as a base to about 2023-24. This also had 2 years of COVID in between. This data is predominantly for the 600,000 workforce that work at Quess. Now, Quess, as you know, is the intermediary of getting people from the informal labor market to the formal labor market for the very first time. So A, you're dealing with entry-level workers. B, you're dealing with workers who are typically on an outsourced role. C, you're dealing with people who are either freshers to 1 to 2 years of experience. And D, you're dealing with a base which was 2019, and then we had 2 years of COVID impact. Now, let me just add one quick dynamic before I pause here. India's minimum wage average still continues to be at about 13 to 15,000 rupee. Now, many states are below the 15,000 rupee mark. And had social security code or the labor code being implemented, which is already approved by parliament more than 2 years ago by all the states and ratified, we would have been in a situation where a national floor wage would have come out. So again, coming back to this point, I think you have to keep that in context.
Got it. No, I take your point that these are COVID years and these are entry-level workers. Those are two very important takeaways when we measure this. But I mean, it's still like, how does a person live in 17,500 rupees? It looks a little tough. And this is formal sector. What happens when people are not in the formal sector? Amit Basole, you're the master of that data. You tell us, if this formal sector data is so shocking, is it worse in the informal sector? Maids and gig workers, I think, in Mumbai earn a little more.
Right. Thanks, Latha. So I think, if you look at the periodic labor force survey, which is the official employment survey of the government of India, comes out annually and gives us a picture of the entire workforce. There too, the story is similar in the sense that wage growth has been very tepid. In fact, I would say earnings growth in overall, because it measures self-employment earnings and regular wages and casual wages, gives us the trends for all of them. And since the survey started coming out in 17-18, the regular wage growth has been barely, let's say, 2% or 1% annual. Self-employment earnings have been doing even worse, and we can come to that later if you wish. So the story is corroborated on a labor, on the wide labor market. The one bright spot, so to speak, is casual wages, which actually have been growing quite strongly in PLFS. Not much has been talked about over there. So something to perhaps explore. But yeah, on regular salaried work and so on, the story checks out on the entire labor market as well, including informal.
And the actual salaries also will be, below 50. As Lohit pointed out, informal would be like 13,000 perhaps.
Yeah, the levels are also not that different. If I recall correctly, the average regular salaried worker in PLFS would be somewhere around 15,000 rupees per month.
Okay, so in the first level of formality, they are not earning much more. It's just that it is formal and they probably have ESIS and those benefits. Dr. Balakrishnan, now to come to you, sir. We all sat up in terms of the growth suddenly capitulating to 5.4% and that getting corroborated by corporate India. If you think GDP is not very clean data, corporate earnings growth is clean data. That earnings growth was like, less than 5%, low single digits in the second quarter. Is there a sudden development in terms of the labor market going astray?
I don't think this is so sudden, because if you look at two sources, one is the PLFS data and the other is the data for rural wages from the Labor Bureau. Over the past 5 years itself, real wages have declined in some areas and some sectors very drastically, by about 25% for the self-employed earnings, that is, over the past 5 years, except, interestingly enough, for casual workers, whether you look at the similar Labor Bureau data or the PLFS data, for casual workers, it's increased. So, but for all other sectors, it's decreased very substantially. I just want to say that, in my view, this is not a particularly a recent development. It's been happening for the past 5 years, and it's not surprising because the inflation rate has been very high for the past 5 years, right? The food inflation rate. Yeah, so it makes, and inflation, but especially food inflation.
Okay.
So it's not surprising. It's not all that recent. And while the data on the corporate sector is very, very clear, and we have to thank Quess for it, I just want to say the problem is probably wider than just the corporate sector in India.
Okay, no, Dr. Balakrishnan, let me rephrase the question that people have as investors or as observers of the economy. You know, one interpretation of the slowdown was that fiscal spending just collapsed in the first quarter and the second quarter of the current fiscal because of elections and because of perhaps extreme heat. We got all those reasons. And because the Reserve Bank's policy for other reasons tightened because of dollar buying and liquidity, dollar selling by the RBI and liquidity tightness, they went after unsecured loans. We thought that was the reason for the slowdown. But are you saying that those are temporary and this is the bigger reason, or is it the other way around?
I would say that. I mean, it seems to me that whatever has been budgeted, maybe capex in the past 6 months has slowed, I believe. But the RBI's role cannot be very great because the rate of interest, which is the key variable, has remained, nominal rate of interest has remained the same for the past 22 months or something. So I would say there's a deeper problem of declining real wages, and maybe the immediate problem could be that capex has not been maintained. Sorry, the central government's capital expenditure, not the private sector, has not been maintained at the same level as it was in 23-24. So that's my view.
That's in calendar 2024. Clearly, for 6 months, they did not spend as much as the budget estimates indicated. Where do we see things to be repaired as we expect that 7% growth? Since we have been having decent growth in the last 3 or 4 years, and we suddenly saw this drop, do we first fix the fiscal deficit and the RBI's tight liquidity policy? Will that keep us still at 7%, or is 7% difficult unless we graduate more people to at least the lower middle class?
Well, if the private investment rate does not really take off, clearly growth can be maintained only if public investment or public capex remains very high. The other is, I think the main thing to try and fix now is inflation. Without fixing inflation, you can't fix the slow growth of consumption, which lies behind the slow growth of manufacturing output in particular, and the economy more generally. So yes, capex will have to remain, though some of it is depressing in the destructive impact that some public investment is happening on natural capital, etc. But from a macroeconomic point of view, that would be necessary if private investment is not buoyant, and you must fix inflation. RBI's role, in my view, right now is not very great.
Yeah. No, I take your point entirely, sir. RBI can fix perhaps core inflation. They can't do much about food inflation. And maybe the missing chairs in this discussion would be perhaps people like Professor Ramesh Chand and Dr. Gulati, who would tell us why is food inflation for 18 months so stubbornly high? Either it is pulses, or it is potatoes, or it is other veggies. But that discussion for another day. For the moment, we have to take a break with the conclusion that it's a combination of causes, both fiscal spend being low and urban wages not taking off, urban jobs not taking off, and rural wages, of course, suffering as they always have. That's the cause of the slowdown in the economy. We will come back and look for solutions from our experts back in a minute.